Hello, good evening, welcome. Please take a seat. Thank you. As the director of the Italian Culture Institute in Los Angeles, it is my pleasure to introduce this special lecture on the Egyptian Museum of Turin, given by the museum's director, Christian Greco. As many of you know, the museum is one of the world's leading museums for Egyptian archaeology and houses one of the largest and most important collections of ancient Egyptian antiquities in the world. I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Consul General of Italy, Antonio Verde, and in a few minutes also Ambassador Lamia McMahon, the Consul General of Egypt, and also film director Rossella Schillaci, who took part of this film festival that is still going on, starring Europe, and she's the one participating for Italy with Ghetto PSA that I hope you had a chance to watch a few days ago. I would also like to thank Kathleen Clooney for Associate Professor of Ancient Egyptian Art and Architecture and Chair of the Department of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA for a precious collaboration. Dr. Greco's talk this evening will highlight the masterpieces of the museum and the extension, renovation, and reorganization of it, which was undertaken in celebration of the museum's 200th anniversary and was directed by Dr. Greco himself. Dr. Greco was previously professor of Egyptology at the University of Leiden and served as curator of the Egyptian collection at the Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, organizing exhibitions not only in the Netherlands, but also in Finland, Spain, and Japan. He is also a member of the American Epigraphic Mission in Luxor and co-director of the Dutch Archaeological Mission in Saqqara. He has helped organize a number of international research programs with such partners as the Musée du Louvre, the Vatican Museums, UCLA, and he has written many important scholarly works in Italian, French, English, Dutch, and Spanish. I would like to thank Dr. Greco and his staff for their collaboration in organizing this event. The event would not be possible without them. Thank you very much. As a courtesy to others now, I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones for the duration of the presentation. Thank you for your cooperation. We hope to see you soon again at the Italian Culture Institute in Los Angeles and highlight a few events that will take place next week and the week after. On May the 16th, we will screen the West Coast premiere of the documentary Caravaggio, The Soul and the Blood, a documentary depicting the life, works, and struggles of Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, and it's organized by the Italian Culture Institute in collaboration with Sky. We're also looking forward to another delightful lecture on art history on June the 14th, given by LACMA curator Naoko Takahote, on the exhibit she curated entitled The Chiaroscuro Woodcut in Renaissance Italy. The exhibit will open on June the 3rd at the LACMA. So thank you so much to all of you for your attendance, and now please join me in giving a very warm round of applause to Christian Greco.
Well, dear Director, thank you for your kind invitation and your words. Consul General, thank you for your attendance tonight. And I will try to describe in less than 1 hour what are the main issues concerning a museum, an archaeological museum nowadays, and especially an archaeological museum with Egyptian antiquities. How can it connect to the society where it is placed, and how research can be an answer to the challenges that we have for the future. So let me start by challenging you. Ian Hodder, one of the leading archaeologists, is the director of the archaeological project in Çatalhöyük in Turkey, published a couple of years ago a wonderful book called Entangled, where he showed how the material culture and mankind are entangled. Actually, in a kind of weird way, we create our material culture, but material culture survives us. And how should we use material culture of the past to understand our society? Then he published this drawing talking about a place, a Mesolithic place, Lepinsky Vir. You see it's a society of hunters and gatherers, but all in a sudden, in the middle of the place, there is a piano. And how is it possible that a piano lives in such a society? To make a piano, you need to go and fetch wood, you need to organize labor, you need to have a whole series of activities that would be impossible without an organized society. But he published these photos to make us realize how it is important to give a context to objects and to realize how objects must be understood within the concept where they functioned. And if we move from Lepinsky Vir to Italy, to Pompeii, and we go to the storerooms of Pompeii, we see all those jars. And those jars made me think of what Heidegger wrote in 1971 in a very important publication, The Thing, where he reflects about what is archaeological past, archaeological material, and how a jug or a jar can be the element that connects mankind to the earth, because mankind produce a jar and produce it using the clay, and how this can be connected to the gods, because a jar is produced by mankind, as I said, using clay, and then it could be used in a kind of ritual, in a funerary ritual or in a temple, doing libation, for instance. And so when we study a jar, if we are very careful, we don't only study the morphology and the shape of it, but we try to understand why it was used for, what it was used for, and it can give answer about society. If we move from Pompeii and we go to Egypt, here we are in Luxor, we have to realize we are in the Temple of Karnak, that every kind of archaeological landscape we have is an invented and created landscape. No one in ancient Egypt would have seen what we are seeing now. When you see this column here, this column was built by King Taharka in the 25th dynasty. This pylon was built by the Ptolemies. The part of the Great Pillar Hall was built by King Seti I and his son Ramses II. And what we are seeing here on the foreground is the Temple of Khonsu, built in this form by Ramses III. So we see different time periods living in the same time, and actually we're walking through history, sometimes not realizing where we are. If we go to Luxor Temple, there is this drawing which was published in La Description de l'Égypte. You see a Luxor Temple that we don't see anymore. You see two obelisks, but now there is only one because the other one is in Place de la Concorde. And especially we see all these kind of buildings which were part of medieval Luxor, which is not existing anymore. And well, if we go a little bit further in time, this photograph was taken in 1849 by Maxime Ducamp, who went to Egypt together with Flaubert, and he was the first photographer sent by the Académie Française to go to Egypt and photograph the monuments. You probably know that when in 1838 François Arago announced in Paris that the daguerreotypie was invented, the first connection that was made was with Egypt. He said, finally, we will have a camera which will enable us to document the millions and millions of hieroglyphs which are on the temple. And, well, the idea was that if you could photograph the hieroglyphs, well, all the documentation was done, and actually Egyptologists were not needed anymore. Fortunately, it's not the case, because otherwise we won't have a job. So we still work on photography, and we draw the hieroglyphs. But Maxime Ducamp went to Egypt, and he documented the Temple of Luxor, how it was at that time. So we see the temple, but you see all these kind of structures, which was the medieval structure of the temple. And when you walk nowadays inside the temple, you see you still have the mosque of Abu Hajjaj, and the mosque is resting on a previous building. And when you look at the building and how it was built, we see that there are part of an inscription in Latin, We can here read the word Kaiser, Kaiseri, so a dedication still to a Caesar, to one of the emperor. And when we look around the temple, we also see there are dedication inscriptions in Greek, a dedication inscription to the emperor and to the god Ammon. When we look at the Luxor Temple, we see that it was built in many different times. So you see Amenophis III, then Ramesses II, and then this in the Roman time. And when you think of the name Luxor in Arabic, Luxor is the plural of the word Qasr, and Qasr is the translation in Arabic of castrum. So actually, Luxor means encampment, was a military encampment. And we do know that in 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian established himself in the temple, and I'm going to show you something shocking now, at least it's still shocking for me, that in the main chapel of the temple there were these wonderful frescoes attesting the arrival of Diocletian in Luxor. Ladies and gentlemen, these were the largest frescoes of late Roman antiquities which were preserved. And they had been preserved until 1916. So you see the soldiers arriving, and then here were the Thracian, and here we had the two emperor and the two Caesars. And what happened? In 1916, Legrand decided to excavate the temple and to take out all the later addition, and in thinking that those were Coptic frescoes, they were taken out and have been destroyed forever. Only a small part of it has been preserved. Why am I telling you this? Because we have to be very careful. It's one of the duty of a museum to answer the question, to whom does the past belong to? And also, what should we preserve? Do we have the right to destroy part of the cultural heritage? And if you think that those kind of things could happen only in the 19th century, unfortunately, you are wrong. Probably those of you who have been in Egypt are familiar with this kind of images that of the West Bank in Thebes. So you have houses and animals, and actually there was a place of the living Egyptian interconnected with a place of the death. You can clearly see here you have modern houses, and this was the entrance to a tomb. So in the necropolis there were Egyptians living, and that had been going on for more than 200 years. And actually the first Egyptologists who went to Egypt and rediscovered Egypt thinks about Champollion and the Italian Rosellini, think about Wilkinson. They lived in the necropolis. And then the Egyptians settled down there as well, because it was a way to have their work guaranteed. They could work in the excavations, and they could welcome tourists and sell to the tourists all kind of gifts. Actually, when you went around the village, it was also quite nice, because in the part outside of the houses, you could see all this kind of representation, represented 200 years of the Hajj, of the holy pilgrimage to Mecca. And it was very nice because you could see also the evolution of the Hajj. The first one would go walking to Mecca up to the time where people went by plane. And in 2006, while I was working for the epigraphic survey of the Oriental Institute of Chicago in Egypt, our director told us, well, please go around the village and document what's happening, because Samir Faraj, who was the governor of Luxor, decided that Luxor should become the biggest open-air museum in the world, where people didn't have a place. So Egyptians had to move to the north. And actually, I saw happen many times that all the goods were taken out of the houses, like you see here, and the next thing was a bulldozer going over the house, and the inhabitants of the house had to see that, and the result, here you go, the house is completely destructed. And after that, they would get a key to go to a new apartment. But my question is now, is archaeology sustainable if you do anything of the kind? Well, these were the images of the houses half destroyed, and this is the head of my workman Badawi, who brought me to the place where he used to live together with his family, where his family lived for 200 years, and as you see, it was all gone. So if in 2006 these were the images that you would get of Gurna, the images so many of us were familiar with, this is the images that you have today. And it was also quite peculiar because while this was going on, we would talk about conservation. There were meetings about conservation of antiquities or managing Egypt's cultural heritage. Well, so the first question that I have for you tonight: is archaeology sustainable if archaeology is not linked with the life of people? Well, you understand the questions. That's why we start talking more and more about public archaeology. Archaeology has to be connected with the society. We have to understand that the past is a DNA, our DNA of our history, and is the key to live in our future. But we cannot do it completely in a disconnected way. We cannot just have academic problems completely disconnected by the real life of people. And how does a museum can go on with that? I think that the main task of a museum should be that of doing research. Without research, I don't think that a museum can survive. And research can link the collection, the material culture, to the people. The Egyptian Museum in Turin has been reopened on the 1st of April 2015. It's one of the largest archaeological museums in Italy. We have 2.5 kilometers of visiting path, and as you see, it's a museum. Here we are in the beautiful tomb of Ka, of which I will talk later on. Here you see the galleries of the late period. Here we are in the Middle Kingdom, going all the way to the late period. Here again, Ka, the tomb chapel of Maya. We are in a beautiful Baroque building where we can exhibit more than 50,000 objects. We are the second most important collection outside of Egypt, and we have chosen, as you see in these images, to be a mainly archaeological museum where archaeology is the key to understand the material culture, to link it from the place of provenance, and to try to use it as a document that can tell us important information about the past. And here you see some of the wonderful treasures we have: the tomb of Kha and Vazet, the late period again, the mummies, the so-called tomb of the Three Sisters, all the way to the Islamic period, because we have a collections that starts in the at the end of the 4th millennium, and we go all the way to the Islamic period. So on the 1st of April 2015, we reopened the museum. But what was the future of a museum? Should we see the refurbishing of a museum as the end of a process, or was it a new beginning? Well, it was a new beginning, because when this collection needed to be studied, to be linked, I always say that the biggest gift I gave to the Egyptian museum, or Museo Egizio, as I should say, I always say I don't translate it, with the only exception of Arabic, so I call it Al-Mataf al-Masri or Museo Egizio, because it should be something which denotes immediately the museum, make it recognizable. Well, the first important step that the Museo Egizio did was that of going back to Egypt. We have an excavation in Saqqara. We operate here 200 meters to the south of the Step Pyramid. It's an excavation that this year celebrated the 43th anniversary from the start. It started in 1975 when Geoffrey Martin of the Egypt Exploration Society decided, together with the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, to go back to Egypt to give a context to the beautiful statues which were housed in the museum in Leiden. So one after the other, the tombs were discovered. The tomb of Horemheb, who was the general of the army of Tutankhamun, and later he became king himself, or the tomb of Maya, who was Imi per Hajj Nesut, you say in Egyptian, which means the Ministry of Finance of ancient Egypt. And so these beautiful tombs, which were so-called temple tombs, why do we call them temple tombs? Because you have a monumental gate leading to a courtyard, then you have a statue gallery, and then an inner courtyard with behind a pyramid. They have the same structures of a temple, and underneath, through a shaft, you could go out to a pillar chamber and a burial chamber underneath the ground. That was the realm of the disease. And here you see the beautiful tomb and burial chamber of Maya. It's the only decorated tomb whose underground burial chamber are decorated, which is preserved in Memphis. And here you see in the very moment where we try to read and document the text that we found. Well, from the 1st of May 2015, the Museo Egizio went back to the field. For decades, the Museo Egizio had not been excavating anymore. I was co-director of the Dutch archaeological mission to Saqqara, and now the Dutch archaeological mission has become the Italian-Dutch archaeological mission. We are working mainly in two areas, to the south and to the north of our concession, and I want to show you some of the results of the latest excavation, because I just got back from Egypt actually last week, Friday. What have we found? Well, last year I had a little bit the mad idea to excavate to the north of Maya. Why the mad idea? Because I knew exactly that was the place where our excavation debris was, because we were excavating for 40 years and all the debris was dumped here. So we had to excavate through our dumps, which has been quite an effort. You see here, after 6 weeks of excavation, we reached this containing wall, which was made by the excavation itself in 1986. So we already knew we were not yet in archaeological soil. But little by little, the evidence began to come out. So we found this very nice limestone chapel with a shaft in front of it, and next to it, we found this coffin. And this is quite weird, because a coffin should not be lying on the soil of the desert. It should be in a place underneath the ground. And so we were wondering what had happened there. But when we looked at it from nearby, we understood immediately. Well, this was the leftover of looters of the 19th century. What had they done? They had taken out a coffin from the shaft, put it out here. If you see, we don't have a lid anymore. The lid probably was broken into pieces and sold to different collections worldwide. When you look at the mummy, you see the feet all the way up to the knees, and the rest is gone, because probably the mummy was unwrapped to see whether there were jewels, and the rest was left over. And the robbers also left this. You can clearly see here, you see limestone blocks, you see mud bricks. These are blocks belonging to an ancient tombs, which were used as a retaining wall so that they could excavate a hole to see whether there was something underneath the ground and be protected from the sand that otherwise would fall. So when we opened the shaft and we went down, we knew we were not the first people, so unfortunately the shaft had been looted. Just to the west, we found another, you see this big structure, it's a New Kingdom chapel, and when you look at this very nice, unique scene, you see these feet, and then there are another feet here of a person who's sitting on a chair, and then there is another figure of a little girl sitting there. These are Ramesside Chapel. So if I have to give you a date, 1250 before Christ, and those chapels were built on top of the 18th dynasty occupation. So all in a sudden, this wall appeared last year. So this year we went back to Egypt. This is the very moment when we go back to the field full of expectations, and well, you know, it's so nice to finally be back in Egypt and being able to do field work. So I want to show you an amazing discovery we made this year. So we went on excavating this area. So we are on the north, to the north of the tomb of Maya. First of all, look at this hole. We were, because we had this hole here, we have another hole here, we have another here, and we were wondering what are those holes. And then we discovered those are holes made by the looters in the 19th century. So people would go to the necropolis, excavate, and take out objects. But then a beautiful thing appeared this year. All in a sudden, a workman called me and he said something was appearing. Look at those heads. Well, I cannot tell you that is a very exciting moment when from the sand all in a sudden shape takes place. You see our curator Paolo Del Vesco that while cleaning wanted to make photos right away. You see myself trying to interpret and studying the what was on the wall, and then after cleaning we saw this beautiful family stela which is just on the level on the floor. These statues are 50 centimeters high, so you see a man and a woman. She's embracing him. He has on the shoulder, you see the hand of the woman. Here is another man embraced by this other woman with their beautiful gowns, and you cannot really see it, but on their sides they have two children. And this is the excavation scene from above. So we have this nice chapel. We have a Coptic occupation layer, and here, so you see this wall with this corner, this wall with this corner here, and two columns. Here there is a new tomb coming up, which we will excavate next year. From this corner to this corner, there are 6.90 meters, so it's quite a large tomb of the 18th dynasty, and we're going to excavate it. And I want to show you also how a shaft looks like. This is from the surface going down. At the bottom, there is, there was this huge stone, and then there was a room opening to the north and a room opening to the south. In the meantime, we have a nice cooperation with the Politecnico of Milano, which enabled us to make a 3D imaging of all the tombs. So we are making 3D models of all the tombs to document them and also to be able to show the research we are doing in the museum. And nothing of this could be done without the help of my team and especially of our Egyptian friends. Yeah, you only see a part of it. It was the last day of the excavation, and unfortunately, you see, it was a cloudy day. It started raining, and this is the last thing you want, because then you have clay everywhere, you cannot make proper photographs, but of course, it's the Murphy law. It never rains in Egypt, but the only day you have to make photographs, it was pouring with rain. But why are we excavating, you could ask me? Why does a museum go back to Egypt for excavations? Actually, to repair what was done in the 19th century. You heard me talking about looting many times. Well, you know, at the very beginning of Egyptology, when Egypt was rediscovered by the West, let's say after the journey of Napoleon to Egypt from 1799 to 1801, we entered the so-called period of the consuls. The diplomats in Egypt had a parallel activity, that of doing excavation in the sites. So the Consul General of France was Bernardino Drovetti, and he collected 5,600 objects which were brought to Livorno. Livorno was kind of hub of Egyptology. All the kings of Europe would send their delegates to Livorno in order to buy antiquities. The most prestigious thing that a country could have was to have antiquities, Egyptian antiquities, that would define the prestige of your own country. In Turin happened exactly the same. 5,600 objects of Drovetti on the market. Drovetti first tried to sell them to Russia. Russia said no because of the price. Then to the Le Musée Charles X, which is the Louvre nowadays, and France said no, because the arrival of 5,600 objects in the post-Napoleonic France, well, people were afraid that these Egyptian objects could put into doubt the truth of the Bible, so they didn't buy it. So, well, fortunately, Turin could buy it, and it's very interesting to look in the history. There was a nobleman native of a little place, Conzano, in Monferrato. I'm a honorary citizen of Conzano, and sometimes people become honorary citizens of New York. I'm honorary citizen of Conzano, but I'm very proud of it, because even though it's a small village, and actually I became honorary citizen last year, and it was a wonderful anthropological experience, because I was welcomed by the musical department, let's say, of the state police, and that was the bishop waiting for me, and the mayor, and then there was this ceremony, and then we all ate together, and so now I'm honorary citizens of this wonderful city. Why? Because I wanted to make public the story of Carlo Vidua. He was a nobleman coming from Conzano, and he wrote to the king in 1819. He went to Alexandria in Egypt. He saw the collections of Drovetti, and he said, Turin has to buy this collection. Only if Turin will buy this collection, Italy will be a great country. 1819, Italy didn't exist yet. Italy was unified in 1861. So 42 years in advance, he said, Italy will be a great country because we will have the most important archaeological collection in Rome, the most important galleries in Florence, and the most important Egyptian collection in Turin. Well, the king was convinced, and he bought it for 400,000 Piemontese lira. Nowadays, it would mean 60 million euros, but there is another figure which is even more important. It means 3/4 of the budget of the kingdom. And you can imagine that I've used this argument with the Ministry of Culture many times in Italy, trying to convince him to say, well, do something revolutionary. Give 75% of the budget of Italy for culture. Well, of course, he didn't listen to me. But, well, something revolutionary was made. But while all these collections were formed, so the Drovetti collection arrived to Turin, the second Drovetti collection went to Paris, the Salt collection went to the British Museum, the Nizzoli collection went to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Well, so the objects got dispersed all over Europe. I give you an example, and I'm preparing an exhibition on this. In 2020, we will have an exhibition which will be called A Portrait of a Family. In Turin, we have this wonderful granite sarcophagus belonging to Jehutimes. In front of him, there is the sarcophagus of his wife, Azet. Jehutimes was the intendant of the Temple of Amun in Karnak, and his wife, Azet, was chantress of Amun in Karnak. So Jehutimes had for himself a beautiful tomb built, which is nowadays known as TT32 or Theban Tomb 32. The tomb was reused in the Roman time, in the time of Trajan and Hadrian, when a priest, again Soter, decided to build a tomb for all his family. The tomb was found in 1819 by Lebolo, who was working for Drovetti, and offered to a British collector, who said no. And then Lebolo decided to cut up the unified tombs in different lots and to sell it all over the world. The result nowadays, in Turin, we have as I said, the two sarcophagi, granite sarcophagi of Jehutimes and Azet, and we have a door jamb where you can clearly see here the name Jehutimes. Then we have the Roman occupation, so we have a small mummy of Petamenophi. His aunt is in Leiden, in the Netherlands. His grandparents' coffin and mummies are in London. You see here the beautiful coffins with the representation of the goddess Nut. His parents are in Paris, and his siblings and cousins are in Berlin. So it looks like a European project, and actually what we want to do now is to put them together to study them and to give them a context. That's why we go back to excavate. A lot of people ask me, are you allowed to take objects outside of Egypt? Of course not. Everything will stay in Egypt. But what we take home with the nice cooperation that we have with our Egyptian colleagues is the knowledge and giving a context of objects which sometimes are in our museum, in the museum in Cairo, in the museum in Leiden, in the museum worldwide. So we try to reconstruct a context and to convey the message that the objects are important not only because they are objects of art, but because they tell a story. And I want to tell you a wonderful story, the story of the discovery of the most important tomb we have, the tomb of Hajj, the only complete tomb of the New Kingdom outside of Egypt. And I want to bring you back on the 16th of February 1906. On that day, the workmen of Schiaparelli, the then director, found an opening on the cliff. Excavating the opening, they found a shaft. The shaft was 8.50 meters deep. At the end of the shaft, he found some steps of a first room which was blocked off, a second room which was also blocked off, and when he removed it, Schiaparelli found himself in front of this door which was still sealed, and he realized that he was in front of an intact tomb. He realized that for the first time after 3,000 years was opening a tomb, and in putting together all the photographs which he made, we can enter with him inside the tomb and relive the very emotional moment when he found his tomb intact with 550 objects. You see the sarcophagus of Hajj, the sarcophagus of Merit, still covered with the linen and all the organic material. Here we have the residue of bread, we have meat, we have fish, we have jars containing oil and beers. Here is the bed of Hajj. This is a drawing which was published by Schiaparelli in 1927, and all this beautiful tomb is now in Turin. I always say that a visit to Italy, you see the workmen, the moment they come out of the tomb and take all the objects, first to Luxor, from Luxor they went by boat to Cairo, from Cairo to Alexandria, from Alexandria to Genoa, and then finally to Turin. I always say that a visit to Italy is worthwhile to see the only New Kingdom intact tomb which is preserved outside of Egypt, which is in Turin. So I hope you believe me and you come and visit the museum in Turin, and it's really beautiful, this tomb. Not only is beautiful, but it's incredibly important. We have jars which are still sealed, and the jars contain the residue of oil, beer, and wine. Actually, you're always faced with a problem as a director. What do? Do you take out the clay stopper in order to do invasive analysis to understand what is inside, so you actually contaminate a context which has remained intact, or what are you supposed to do? Actually, we try, of course, to preserve the collection as much as we can, being aware that I always say we've inherited the collection from our sons, not from our fathers. We have the duty to give the collection as intact as possible to the future generations. So we decided to try and go to a center where you have neutronic activation nearby Oxford. So we decided to go there when I had I talked with the director, and the director told me that it cost 20,000 euros per hour to use the machinery they had. So I said, well, of course, I'm sorry, we don't have the money. But then he told me on the phone, could you explain me what is the tomb of Hajj exactly? And when I did it, he became so enthusiastic that he told me, okay, you can come. I will give you 12 days, 24 hours a day. So actually donated to the museum more than 5 million euros. And we made the first analysis, and we are now trying to understand what kind of wine, especially what kind of oil was preserved in those jars. Not only, we had the intact body, the intact mummies of Hajj and Merit. So I can show you how Hajj has this wonderful color of gold and these earrings, and you have to realize that the one who discovered the mummies never saw it inside, because Schiaparelli wrote in a letter that it was better to leave the mummies wrapped, and he wrote that there will be a day when it would be possible to look inside without running the risk to harm the mummies, and the day is coming now. And in a museum which is very rich of objects but very poor jewelry, he never looked inside, and now we are completely able to look and to see. For instance, you see there are rings in the pubic area. And I'm going to show you something that my public in Turin haven't seen yet, because going from the raw data, we can virtually unwrap the mummy. We are doing that in cooperation with the British Museum and with Stockholm, is unwrapping layer by layer so that we finally can see how Hajj looks like. And actually, you see, it's like peeling. You go inside the mummy, and in the next step you will see the skin. So for the first time we can look Hajj in his face and see how it's preserved. And you see this jewelry, how beautiful it is, how well preserved. You see the earrings fell down from the ears because they were so heavy. And this is the color of honor. It's called a Mio gold, which was given by the king, by the functionary who were so important. And this is the heart scarab, which is probably inscribed with chapter 30a and 30b of the Book of the Dead. Unfortunately, we are not able yet to read the hieroglyphs which are on the back, let's say, just against the chest, but we are studying with the Polytechnic of whether we can use a different kind of CT scan in order to be able to read hieroglyphs. And then, we can go to all different kind of levels. So in the next step, you will see only the skeleton with the jewels. You see that the skeleton has been pretty damaged, probably happened after death, and here the jewels. What we are going to do next year is to print the jewels, so you will have the mummy untouched, of course, unwrapped, and then a showcase when we can do 3D printing of the wonderful jewelry. Not only him, his wife, Merit, had this wonderful weather color with these earrings. And when we look at his poor wife, of course, we also see that her spine and her thorax has been completely damaged. But let me show you probably the project I'm more attached to, the papyri projects, because, of course, material culture is important. When you have written material culture, you really get in touch with the ancients. You can really read them and understand where we're thinking, where we're living. In Turin, we have one of the most important finds. We have the village of the remains coming from the village of Deir el-Medina, which the ancient Egyptians called Pa-Demi, the village. The village was founded by Amenophis I, with 120 families which were established there in order to do only one thing, to build the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And in Turin, we have 26,000 fragments of papyri, of everything. Private transactions, official transactions. We have different journals of the necropolis telling us who was going to work, who was not going to work, the reason why they were going to work or not going to work. We know also, we also have love letters. We have the satirical erotic papyrus. We also have letters when it appears who was cheating who with whom. So we have a lady who invites her lover to visit her, saying, I will fake a disease, so my husband will never know that you have come for me. He will think that you have come because I was sick. And the poor woman did not expect us to read her letter nowadays and to discover that she was cheating her husband. And well, we will also publish, of course, those things. And what we are doing, we have an international cooperation with the University of Liège, Basel, Copenhagen, Munich. And what we are doing, we made this theoretical framework, so we make a distinction between objects, witness, and document. So, of course, every single fragment for us is an object. Every fragment has to get an inventory number, otherwise, objects in museum get lost. Every fragment can have different kind of text. It can be written on the recto and on the verso, and the text can belong to different documents. So we document all the witnesses, the text we call them witnesses, and we try to reconstruct the documents. And I can show you an example. You see here is a fragment, when we realign them, and when the final is this. We are able to put finally together a letter and to understand it. 26,000 fragments. Our curator responsible of the material culture, Susanna Toffer, wrote in a proposal for a ERC grant that the archive of the Medina in the Museo Egizio in Turin is so important to Egyptology as Pompeii is important to Rome. It makes you understand the scale of this immense unpublished archive that we have, and really, we really have worked for the coming 100 years for many Egyptologists that can come and work with us and try to understand this text. Also because we have written in hieratic, which are cursive kind of hieroglyphs. Not only, but some of them are written in an abnormal hieratic, where more or less only 6 people around the world are able to read it. So you understand how difficult it is, but how important it is to document this in very important part of knowledge. All the research we are doing, I'm very proud of that, is finding his place in the new scientific journal we published, the Rivista del Museo Egizio. It's published in Italian, French, German, and English. They are the language of Egyptology, and we have a summary from each article in Arabic. It's free, so everybody can go to the site, download it. It's only digital, which doesn't mean it's not a PDF file, which is what is available for everybody online, but it's HTML, so you can go inside and you can zoom in the photographs, having 3D models, and we wanted to have this so widespread as possible. And as you will see, if you go to the site, you're completely free to download and to read the articles. So I show you a couple of articles that we have published this year. The journal is double peer-reviewed, so all the articles go through a peer review process, and it's also important for us because we have asked the Ministry of University and Scientific Research in Italy to recognize us as a research center, and so it's also very important that we have a scientific journal. And let me conclude going to something quite important that we have at the moment. You probably know that this year in Europe is the year of cultural heritage. We have decided to have an exhibition on this. It's called Anche le statue muoiono, also statues die. And what we want to think is how cultural heritage is in danger and how certain processes have been happening for years. So, for instance, in the first room, we have those photographs made by a very important Italian photographer, Mimmo Iodice, who made these photographs about cultural heritage in Italy and endangered cultural heritage, and we put it in relationship with fragments coming from Kawel Kabir in Egypt, where statues were intentionally smashed and broken in antiquity when a new dynasty came in, and the images of the previous rulers had to be destroyed. So we have this very nice dialogue between contemporary art and ancient art. When we go to show, and we did some epigraphic work in our statues to document how sometimes we need to put a name in a statues, and it's a process which was done in the past, but it's done also nowadays. We put a graffito, but graffito, we find graffiti also in the Tomb of Horemheb. We find graffiti in hieroglyphs. Sometimes the graffiti say Nefer, Nefer, which means nice, nice. So an ancient Egyptian went there and liked the tomb and wrote it down. And sometimes you put your name, because if you put your name, you hope that you are linked to the cult of the owner of the tomb. And the same happened in our statues, where Rifo, who was the artist working for Drovetti, put her names in all the statues, and actually wrote in all the statues that we have now in the Museo Egizio, wrote, this statue was discovered by Rifo, an agent of Drovetti. And this is one of the work of contemporary art that makes me think the most is exhibited at the Museo Egizio, our temporary exhibition at the moment, is done by a Lebanese artist. His name is Ali Sherry. And actually, what you see here is an eagle, is a pharaoh eagle. And this pharaoh eagle is like threatening what you see here. And what you see here are antiquities bought by the artists in the antiquity market within 2 years. So we see Egyptian antiquities, we see classical antiquities, we see Near Eastern antiquities, Peruvian and Indonesian antiquity. And the message he wants to convey is that the West, symbolized by the eagle, takes over the antiquities all over the world. They put them in a museum where they are not contextualized, because you have this light table. This light table does not give the image of the archaeological context where they come from, because in a museum they become history of art. And since I didn't want to hide myself, I also wanted to show how a museum can be a place of conservation, but a museum can also be a place of distraction, how sometimes collecting and selling antiquities in the past and now has produced problem, has put contexts that once were unified, dispersed all over the world. I wanted to show 2 examples. So in the same room where we exhibited this, we have this statue and this fragment, which I will show you in a moment. Starting with this fragment, it belongs to an official. His name was Nes Or. He lived in the 26th dynasty. In the cartouche, we can read the name Wahib Rey of the king. And actually, this piece, the back of the wig and this inscription pillar, appeared in the antiquity market in Egypt in 1947. It was not bought, and the piece, complete as it is now, was blocked by the police in Italy in 2001 while it was going to Switzerland, and the Ministry of Culture forced the acquisition of this piece. Actually, it's very interesting, because when you look at the front part, it's not original. It was made in the second half of the 20th century. It represents Akhenaton or Tutankhamun. So actually what happened, in the antiquity market they could not sell this piece, so they faked a face in order to enhance the value of the piece. And this shows exactly how a piece is not an historical piece anymore, but it becomes a piece of art, an art object, and that's why a museum gets interested in it. And the same thing could be said if you look at this wonderful fragment of a coffin we have in Turin, belonging to Jetotiouf Ankh. Is the brother of Petosiris. You probably, those of you who have been in Cairo might remember the wonderful sarcophagus with in the museum in Cairo. It's just when you enter to the museum, right to your right side is a black sarcophagus where you have these inlaid hieroglyphs. But actually what you see here, the sarcophagus has been brutally cut because people were not interested in the sarcophagus as a unified piece, but were interested in this piece where you still had the glass inlay in order to sell it in the antiquity market. It happened in 1824. So a museum can be also, as it were, a place of distraction, but a museum should strive and should fight to be a place of preservation. When we had a cooperation with the University of Turin because we wanted to show also cultural heritage that's been threatened in the last few years, especially here. We are in the place of Nineveh. You probably hear it a lot of times on the news because Nineveh is what nowadays is Mosul in Iraq. And unfortunately, the site has been almost completely destroyed, and the University of Turin was present in 2001 to document what was going on in the site, to restore it because they saw that some salt was coming up to the reliefs, and unfortunately the site is now completely destroyed. And I want to show you, well, we have an exhibition, in the exhibition also, this American artist, lives in Los Angeles, Litz Glean, who made a wonderful piece of art, which she called Objects for Substitutions. You probably heard that the Metropolitan Museum of Art was forced to give back some objects to Italy. Objects, actually, is about those objects were illegally excavated in Italy. Here they are. In 2001, then they went to Switzerland. From Switzerland, they were acquired by American collectors, and they finally ended up in the Metropolitan. There are the so-called silver treasure of Morgantina. Well, it's very interesting to look what happened when it came to light and when Italy asked the restitution of the objects, because there was a kind of conflict between the American Association of Museums and the American Association of Archaeologists, using both of them legitimate arguments, but were contradicting on the nature of the objects themselves. Actually, the American Association of Museums said that actually the objects should stay in the United States, using as arguments that the Metropolitan Museum is universal, like Italy wanted these objects back for nationalistic reasons, so universalism versus nationalism. Then they said, of course, the Metropolitan is one of the most important museums in the world, the one who could preserve probably the best these objects. But then they said something which for an archaeologist is very interesting. They said, actually, why should we give back these objects to Sicily? Nowadays, Sicilians have nothing to do with ancient Greek who came to Sicily in the 6th century BC. They have probably the same drops of blood that a American has, which is, from a scientific point of view, is probably true, but the American Association of Archaeology answering saying, well, the objects are not objects of art. They are documents of history. They are part of the documentation of the history of Sicily. When they use this wonderful metaphor, they say there are one page of the history when we have the treasure of Morgantina, and in the last page there are the current inhabitants. So, well, this American artist, Lynn, made these objects made of papers and organic material, and she called it objects for substitution. So when the Metropolitan gave those objects back, they exhibited this exhibition. I think it's very powerful, and there is another very important American artist, Rakowitz, who is doing actually exactly the same, is recomposing the objects that have been looted from the museum in Baghdad and recomposing them using newspaper. And Alayari, who is an Iranian artist, made, I think, one of the most beautiful pieces of art to understand what the past is. And actually, these pieces have been looted from the museum in Baghdad. And what did she do? She went to Chicago, to the Oriental Institute of Chicago. She studied the photos, the drawings, the moment of excavations. She reconstructed these objects, and inside the objects you see something dark. There is a USB stick, and the USB stick contains all the information of the object. So she does a 3D model, she prints the 3D models in resin, and inside you have a USB stick with all the information connected with the objects. And that's something very important for us as well. Every object, every archaeological object has a biography. And only if we study this biography, we understand the role of the objects. Let's rethink what I said in the beginning about Heidegger and the jug, how many information we can have, for instance, studying the archaeology of the residue, to study the last liquid or the last content that was contained in a jar. Well, when we do write the biography of an object, so we study who made the object, what it was made of, when it was found, what is the history of the excavation, the history of the display of this object in a museum, we reconstruct history. And in this case, in a very powerful way, history is present in USB stick. And we also have this, we had this performance made by an Egyptian artist. I think it's very powerful. This Egyptian artist was very struck by the events that of which the Cairo Museum was a victim on the 28th of January 2011, and also the museum in Malawi in 2012, when those two museums were attacked and looted. So he has this very high showcases. They are 2.20 meters, and he does this performance. He comes with stones and he smashes the showcases to show how sometimes cultural heritage can be violated and attacked. And here we see this statue, this our statue, which is giving the back to the showcases as if it doesn't want to see what can happen to cultural heritage. We will have an international symposium on that on the 28th and the 29th of May, which will be opened by Professor Settis, but also by Professor Mattia, who was the one who has discovered the site of Ebla in Syria, and now is not able to go back to Syria. I think it's very important we discuss about this theme in 2018, which is the year of cultural heritage. Well, all this activity that we do, as I said, first of all, research in the fields, when studying the archive, studying the material culture we have in Turin, reflecting on the role of the museum and how a museum, what is the nature of a museum, is important to make a museum a participatory museum. I love this book where you see that people try, well, the museum is a kind of fort, and people try to climb up in order to go inside the museum, and they want to conquer the museum. I had to think, when we reopened the museum on the 1st of April, we were open for 24 hours free of charge. And then you can understand that at the end, those are opening at 12 o'clock at night. I tried to close the doors, and then I had a huge protest of people who wanted to get inside. They were almost fighting, and so I had to go outside to calm them down and to tell them, okay, I will be open for another 2 hours, but then please, then go home, because we need to go to bed. But it's nice that people fight to get inside the museum. And nowadays, the concept of a museum is not a museum that teaches itself what should be happening, but a museum that opens up, that puts his collection at disposal of his public. I'm very glad to be one of the first museums in Italy that have all the collection online, we photograph online, which are free of copyrights, but also a museum that's trying to go outreach, to do community engagement and community inclusions. One of the activities that I like the most is the fact that we go to hospitals. Here you see one of our curators, Federica Facchetti, and she goes on a regular basis to a hospital. It's an image taken in the Children's Hospital in Turin, where we have oncology patients. They're all children, so they can possibly come to the museum, so the museum goes to them. And there is a nice project that we have now, because we also go to prisons. We have a project with the main prison in Turin. They get regularly classes from us, because the prison organizes classes in art history. And not only they get knowledge about the art history, but we ask them to rebuild some of the objects. And then these objects, the replicas, are used by Federica when she goes to the hospital. So the museum becomes a kind of bridge. Hospital and prisons, who would never communicate with each other, can communicate through the material culture. The material culture put all of us on the same level. We are all neutral, and from that we can learn, and the material culture is the DNA of our past, but tell us also who we are. If you see it in a larger picture, in the picture of evolution, we could say that through the material culture of ancient Egypt, we understand who we are, because that is a path in evolution, and looking and understanding that, we understand our role in society nowadays. We are working a lot in social inclusion, especially with the Egyptian community in northern Italy. We have 350,000 Egyptians living in northern Italy, and 1.5 million of Arabs speaking in the northern part of Italy. So we had a program for women, especially designed for women. We were mainly Egyptian women, some of them were Moroccan, and they came to the museum. They were shocked when we announced the project, because they said, well, they couldn't believe there was a project designed especially for them. 150 of them have been formed as guides of the museum, and they are at disposal whenever we have Arabic-speaking guests that can be toured around in the museum. Some of them had never been in the museum. It was wonderful to discuss with them about the material culture. Some of them would say, oh, well, in my grandmother's house, there was a vase that looked like this. And then you see how it becomes important when the material culture becomes recognizable. You can build bridges, as I said, and make connections. I always remember something that Philippe de Montebello, the historic and very famous director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, used to say. He made an exhibition once when he exhibited some medieval manuscripts, and he was criticized because people said, well, this could put the manuscript in danger. And his answer was, is not a few looks of light that can put manuscript in danger. The major danger the cultural heritage has is to be forgotten. When it's forgotten, it's doomed to destruction. So that's why it's so important, first of all, to do research, to reconstruct the biography of the objects, and then to communicate and to find social inclusion, and to have all the population of the city where a museum is inserted live and participate in the life of museum. And that's why we have a special project also with the Arab-speaking community, and it was very nice, a very nice confrontation, for instance, in delicate issue like how do you go about with the exhibition of bodies. And I want to end with a nice Los Angeles touch, because we have a very nice connection with the UCLA. Last year we housed for the first time the summer school, so we had 25 students from Los Angeles that came for 5 weeks to Turin to study with us, to be trained in well, the curatorial work of the museum, to understand the story, the history of the museum, the history of collecting, but also working with Egypt. They had handling session about the textiles and also pottery. So actually it was a very training hands-on. Last year was the first experiment. It went very well. So we are duplicating this year, and I've been talking all day today to see whether we can also enhance this program to make it also more permanent. And I do hope that more and more students from Los Angeles will find materials for their PhD thesis, and in this time, places which apparently are so far apart, Turin and Los Angeles, can be connected through research, and we put our collection at disposal for student, undergraduate and graduate alike. And it's amazing to see that now already 5 students of UCLA are doing their PhD thesis on our material. I thank you for your attention.
We'd like to thank once again Dr. Greco for this wonderful presentation and for ending also in this incredible way with the late that we didn't even know of. And now is happy to take a few questions from you if you like. Thanks again.
And then there were no questions. No, please don't be scared of any curiosity you might have, or yes. It's open every day, including Monday. Monday we are open only in the morning, because then we need at least half a day for doing your maintenance. If you come in the summer, you don't really need to reserve. Otherwise, I would advise to reserve, because I can tell you that the 25th of April is our Liberation Day in Italy, and the 1st of May is, of course, Labor Day. So some people have extended holidays in this period. Well, and in 6 day times, we had more than 50,000 visitors. So if you come in one of those days, you might end up queuing up for 5 to 6 hours, which is wonderful for us, but you can reserve your visit, so you can book online, and then you don't need to queue up, so I advise you to do so.
How difficult it is to get funding for research?
Well, yes. Yes.
What's happening in this country? So how easy or hard is it to get funding now?
It's very difficult, and I can tell you, you probably don't know, we are a private foundation. So the ministry in 2004, the Ministry of Culture in Italy made a kind of experiment with the Museo Egizio. Museo Egizio was in a very bad shape. There were a lot of problems, and it had been kind of neglected for many years. So there was a presence in town of two very important bank foundations, which together with the city hall, the province and the region decided to make a foundation where the Ministry of Culture is represented in the form of the president of the board of the museum. So the president is appointed directly by the ministry. Well, so let's say the region, the city hall, and the two bank foundation put together 50 million euros for the renovation of the museum, and thanks to that money we could renovate. But from the reopening, actually we have to survive only with the money we get from tickets and Turin exhibition and bookshops. So we have a functioning budget of 12.5 million, of which 10 million we earn every year from the tickets, and 2.5 million is from the bookshop and the Turin exhibitions. It's not an immense budget at all, so because with that we have to do everything, including maintenance of the building, and I have to pay my personnel, because the personnel is not paid by the state or anything. So that's why our team is very limited. We only have 41 people. In such a museum we could be much more, but I devoted a large part of our revenues to research. So when I arrived in the museum, there was only one Egyptologist. Now there are 17. As I show you, we have excavation, we have a journal. We have spent already, since the reopening 3 years, 1.2 million on conservation and restoration. And something not many people know, we have one of the major library, Egyptological library in northern Italy, and I have invested, since I arrived, 120,000 euros to enlarge the library, which is also a service that we do for the university, because there is not such a library university, so we house the students from the University of Turin and from Northern Italy in general, graduate and undergraduate, and I'm very glad that we are crowding our library. So I'm trying to do fundraising, crowdfunding, even though I must be honest, we have done very little. I arrived 4 years ago, and the first year I had to reopen the museum. I had to form a team I didn't have, and as you see, we are doing a lot of projects on research and conservation, so actually we didn't have time to do proper fundraising. But it is difficult, even when you go through private money, to convince people to finance a research project. Donors are much more enthusiastic about funding the conservation of a restoration of a piece, something that they can see that has a direct impact. But I'm trying to convince that research is at least as important. Without knowing an object, you cannot even preserve it. So I hope to find donors that are willing to finance young researchers, fellows that can come for a PhD, a postdoc, and join us in the museum. Then another way to finance research, of course, is to try to get a so-called ERC, European Research Council, fund. The museum is capable to get an European Research Council grant as a university, so he hoped to get more funding, and I'm going through the process, as I said, to be recognized an official research center by the Ministry of University and Research, also because if you count in all the universities in Italy, there are 13 Egyptologists from Milan all the way to Sicily. In our museum, we are 17, so there is no other place, no other university where you have so many Egyptologists that can cover the whole diachrony of Egypt. So in that way, we hope also that we can get some financing from the Ministry of University.
Two wonderful programs, one of them is sorry. So one of the programs you mentioned of including the community is a visit for Egyptian women and Arab women to the museum. Is it a one-time event or is it an ongoing effort? Yeah. This is my first question. And is there any other groups that you're including in your project? Yeah. And what do you do? I mean, with the results of these visits, do you? I mean, do you have some association, something? Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your question. It's an ongoing process which will be ongoing for a long period, I hope. Well, the first result that we had of this training of the Arab women, it will result in a publication because they kept all the notes of the classes we gave, and now we will have a publication in Egyptian and Arabic, in Arabic and Italian, of which is very nice because they did it. They put together this book without even telling me, and it's wonderful. We had a cooperation with the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization when the director was Professor Dr. Lanani, who is now His Excellency the Ministry of Antiquities. He sent us 6 curators from Egypt. One of them, Nagwa, she's a wonderful lady, and she's from Asyut. She was flabbergasted to see how many objects we have from Asyut, and she's doing community engagement in Asyut. So I'm trying to involve more and more Egyptians also to come to Turin, something that I didn't say. In June, we will sign an agreement with His Excellency Professor Dr. Elanani, because we formed a consortium of museums led by the Museo Egizio. In this consortium, there is the British Museum, the Louvre, Neues Museum of Berlin, Rijksmuseum van Oudheden of Leiden, the Ministry of Culture in Italy, and led by the Egyptian Museum in Turin. We will help and assist the museum, getting the museum in Tahrir Square to do the refurbishment. His Excellency is very glad of that. I'm more than glad to be able to assist our Egyptian colleague and to work together in such a wonderful project. And we will work there also in capacity building. So actually in the future, we hope to welcome more and more students from Egypt and already people also working in the ministry who can come and we can learn from each other. Something that I haven't mentioned, the labels in the museum are in Italian, English, and Arabic. Because this, we did it already in 2015. You see, we are the second largest collection outside of Egypt. And so I felt there was a duty to have the inscription, to thank Egypt, because without Egypt we wouldn't have the collection, and also to show. I always talked also with His Excellency the Ambassador of Egypt in Italy, and I told him, well, please consider this your house, your home. And I always think I would like to have the Egyptian Museum in Turin to be the largest Egyptian embassy outside of Egypt. That is a place where people can meet and talk. And we have also a nice program with a school. The school is called The Nile. It's an Egyptian school in Turin. And it's wonderful. There are many Egyptian children. So they go to a normal Italian school, but then there is an agreement with the Ministry of Education in Egypt that on Saturday and Sunday, when the Italian students do not go to school, they get Egyptian classes by Egyptian teachers, and also on Christmas holidays and in the summer. So at the end of their school years, they will get the two diploma, the Italian and the Egyptian. So they come to visit, and it's wonderful because, well, all in a sudden the situation is reversed. So the Egyptians are at home and the Italians are the foreigners, and the dynamic between children is amazing. I'm always very jealous because, of course, they speak perfect and fluent Italian, but perfect Egyptian. I wish I could speak as good Arabic. So we are going on in that, and I must tell you that it was we had an activity which we've done already for the third year, and we will carry on. We're trying to reach out to community that do not come to the museums, because we do not have to forget sometimes the social background of people that have immigrated. So sometimes they come from very low social classes, so they didn't have a proper education at home. They never went to museums at home, and so sometimes they don't know that there is a museum. So we always do every year, for 3 months, we offer a discount of 50% for all the Arab-speaking population living in Italy, and we also advert that in Arabic. And it was so wonderful because we had a family coming from Milan. The two ladies were doing just cleaning jobs, and husbands were drivers. And they've been living 20 years in Milan. Milan is 40 minutes by train to Turin, and they didn't know that this museum existed. And it was wonderful to see. So they arrived, and the men they were all dressed up because they didn't know how you would go to a museum. So with a tie, and then they came with the children, and we have a video before you enter the museum, which shows the rule or how you have to behave when you're in the museum. Is in Italian, English, and Arabic. And so there was this Egyptian father telling his children, "Khali balak, pay attention, you have to be very careful because now you're in a museum." And they had to stay there. We had agreed that they would stay 1 hour, and they spent 6 hours in the museums. And the nice thing is they went home so proud that it was this antiquity. So there is a lot of work to do there. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston is doing a lot of community reach with first and second generation immigrants. It takes a long time because even if we advert, especially in Arabic, and we go to the suburbs, people do not think that it's really meant for them. So I'm trying to find here again some sponsors, because what I would like to do is to have students from suburbs and from poor community to get free transportation so that they can come to the museum for free, because sometimes schools do not send their children because they cannot afford it. So this is also something that I'm looking for money, and sometimes it's not that important, but I do believe that a museum has a very social function, and it's very important to include as many people as possible. Yeah.
Yes, I greatly admire the work you've done, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are regarding the maintaining of some of these great antiquities in their countries of origin. There's been an issue regarding the Elgin Marbles for many, many years, and yeah. I just wonder how people like you who work so hard on this think about that issue, because it is an issue.
It is an issue. Let me answer you in a way. In 1970, many countries around the world signed an agreement which is a UNESCO convention. This UNESCO convention has to define what you do with antiquities. And I think we all have to respect that. Actually what it says after 1970, we are not allowed to buy or to accept as a gift anything, and now I talk only about Egypt, that has not come out of Egypt in a documented way, so written way, before 1970. And I follow that in a very, very strict manner. So I don't accept not even gifts. Sometimes people come and say, oh, you know, I have this since my grandparents. I said, well, nice. And I would like to donate it to the museum. I said, well, I'm sorry, I cannot accept unless you have written evidence, because this is ethical behavior that we have to have with the country of origins. Concerning the Elgin Marbles, they've been taken out in a moment when it was legal, according to the time, or the period of the time. We have to consider also that the objects have two kinds of lives, I say all the time. They tell us about something of a period of time of hundreds of thousands of years ago when they functioned in a certain society, but they have now been living also within the museum, and in the museum they have their biography. I did not like to see a few years ago, when you went to the British Museum, you would get a paper where it was written that Greece was not capable of preserving the Elgin Marbles, so they had to stay in the British Museum. As we know now, the Acropolis Museum is one of the most beautiful museums in the world. It's absolutely state-of-the-art museums, and Greece has showed the world that they can build the best museum in the world. I do hope that the British Museum and Greece authority can find a way of cooperation on this issue. Local legislation, of course, the British marble now belong to the British government, and they're part of the cultural heritage of Britain, but it would be wonderful to have a kind of agreement when, for a period of time, for a rotation, the Elgin marble maybe could go to Greece and then come back. So I hope they find a kind of agreement. But, you know, the objects that have legally reached the museum and are part of the countries, they belong also to the story of that country. But I hope that some kind of cooperation can be found. Well, thank you.